Hittite power was founded on military prowess, which in turn was based on Hittite chariots. The chariots needed constant maintenance, and both the warriors who manned them and the horses that drew them required rigorous training. In fact, good war horses were considered more valuable than men. The Hittites used a military manual that set forth in meticulous detail a schedule for equine care and training, when to wash a horse and when to rub it with oil, when to cover the animal with a blanket, how to prepare the horse's feed, and how to exercise the beast each day. So much did Hittites rely on the chariot that the vehicle, in sense, shaped their society. There evolved a powerful class of charioteers, whose aristocratic leaders, in order that they might devote full time to their belligerent calling, were awarded estates by the king. The result was a type of feudal system. In the pinnacle stood the monarch or great king. He was at once head of state, commander-in-chief of the army, which he was fully expected to lead into the field, the supreme judicial authority, the master of his own household, right down to such details as the straining of the royal water. Palace discipline was rigorous. On one occasion, a servant named Zulia was executed for permitting a hare to appear in the king's pitcher. Taking precedence over all else were the ruler's obligations as a high priest. Religious duties were so important that Hittite kings occasionally were compelled to suspend military operations mid-campaign so that they could preside over religious observances at home. Whenever the Hittites suffered a reverse in war, it was taken as a sure sign that they had somehow displeased one or more of their diverse collection of gods. At such moments of crisis, the king would repair to the roof of his palace, enter a prayerful discourse with the deity over 2 tables laden with sacrificial bread. "I have taken refuge with the storm god," the monarch would intone. "Save my life, walk on my right hand, team up with me as a bull to draw the wagon." The storm god thus petitioned was Teshub, often depicted clutching a lightning bolt as he rushed about the mountain tops in a chariot drawn by 2 sacred bulls, Shuri and Huri. He was chief of the Hittite pantheon, a rowdy, even earthy lot, endowed with all manner of human frailty. They feuded among themselves, they lied and cheated, they lusted and were consumed by jealousies. Yet, if their gods were exceedingly unruly, the Hittites themselves were of notably lawful mind. Although all legal authority stemmed from the king, judicial responsibility was designated to local elders, along with provincial military commanders who, as the king representatives, had strict orders to do what is just. Hittite law was remarkably free of the manipulative cruelties of the earlier Babylonian code or those of the later Assyrian Empire. To be sure, defiance of the king's authority met with draconian punishment. The offenders' homes were made into a heap of rubble, and the criminals themselves stoned to death, along with all the members of their families. Other than that, death penalty was mandatory only for bestiality and rape, where the odd distinction was made between seizing a married woman in the mountains, which was a capital crime, and attacking her in her house. In the latter case, if the woman could not be heard crying out for help, she would be put to death, apparently on the theory that she had willingly committed adultery. The basic principle of Hittite law was one of restitution instead of retribution. For example, arsonists were required to replace the property that burned. Even murderers could go free after enumerating their victims' heirs, generally payment of silver, slaves, land, or a house, along with burial costs. For the Hittites, the rule of law extended even to foreign relations, and their empire was in fact a web of states bound together by treaties usually inscribed on tablets of gold, silver, or iron, whose legal force was strengthened by the religious belief of this intensely religious people. A treaty, for instance, typically called down an awful curse upon the signatory who failed to meet its provisions. One such agreement with a neighboring king named Dupiteshub said that if he did not live up to its terms, "May these divine oaths destroy Dupiteshub, his wife, his son, his grandson, his house, his city, his land, and everything that belongs to him." As witnesses, the names of no fewer than 80 gods and goddesses were inscribed. Hittite chariots were always ready to roll against states that declined to accede to the empire's diplomatic demands. The usual excuse for an attack was the nation was harboring Hittite fugitives. In that vein, Mashuli II wrote to the king of nearby Aswa in Anatolia, "My subjects who went over to you, when I demanded them back from you, you did not restore them to me, and you called me a child and made light of me. Up then, let us fight, and let the storm god, my lord, decide our case." Azara paid dearly for its recalcitrance. Its king was slain, and, as Mashuli II wrote, "The total of the civilian captives that I, my majesty, brought back to the royal palace was altogether 66,000. When Mashuli II died in 1306 BCE, he left his son Muatali, an empire strong in its core and buffered by vassal states whose rulers were obligated to answer Hittite call to arms. Only one cloud loomed on the horizon. To the south, resurgent Egyptian forces were preparing to challenge Hittite control over Syria. The Hittite frontier in Syria lay on the Orontes River at Kadesh, which Mutuli's grandfather, Suppu-Alima, had seized almost as an afterthought as the campaign against Mitanni. And it was toward Kadesh that Ramses II, Egypt's aggressive young pharaoh, marched with 4 divisions of his 20,000-man army in the spring of 1285 BCE. But Muatali had warning and more than enough time to mobilize. An Egyptian chronicler of the engagement related that Muatali had gathered together all the countries from the ends of the sea to the land of Hatti. It started out with an army estimated at nearly 17,000 men, including no fewer than 2,500 chariots with their 3-man crews. A guileful commander, Muatali concealed his soldiers just beyond the city of Kadesh, then sent into the Egyptian camp 2 spies, who, pretending to be deserters, told the pharaoh the Hittite army was still lingering far to the north in Aleppo. Spies must have been convincing, because Ramses accepted the tale. With most of his army strung out far behind him, he advanced on Kadesh at the head of a single division, and Muatali, who had wheeled his chariots into position south of the city, forded the Orontes River and savagely attacked the Egyptian division, which broke and fled. Ramses was rescued from defeat by a timely arrival of a regiment of allies, the Canaanites, who held the field until other divisions of the Egyptian army came up. The Hittites finally withdrew behind the fortification of Kadesh. Although both sides later claimed victory, it was the Egyptians who shortly headed for home, leaving Muatali and his Hittites in possession of Kadesh and Syria. For about 15 years, the Hittites and Egyptians were content to glower at each other from within their respective imperial boundaries, the Hittites holding general homogeny over Syria while Egypt exercised power in Palestine. If anything, the Hittites were more disturbed by the rising power of the Syrians, their troublesome neighbors in Upper Mesopotamia, than by the Egyptians. At one point, Assyria's ruler had the temerity to write to a Hittite monarch named Hattushili, calling himself the great king and addressing the Hittite as brother. Hattushili quickly put the upstart in his place. "Were you and I perhaps born of the same mother?" he haughtily replied. "Do not write about brotherhood and great kingship to me." As it happened, Egypt was also fretful about Assyrian ambitions, and was almost certainly in their mutual perception of the threat that the 2 old foes decided to put their differences aside. In the year 1269 BCE, Ramses II and Hattushili concluded a treaty binding their 2 nations to refrain from warring against each other and to fight as allies should they be subjected to aggression by another people. Both powers would faithfully observe the agreement. 2 years after it was made, Ramses II took a Hittite princess as his bride. Yet the era of the Hittites was waning. After Hattushili came a number of nondescript kings, and near the end of the 13th century BCE, monarchical authority was rapidly decaying. Observed a scribe of that period. "His Majesty, my lord, found the inhabitants of Hatti to be in revolt." Thus weakened, the empire was helpless against the onslaught of a new wave of invaders, seafarers who appeared in the eastern Mediterranean in the late 13th century. Their origins are not certain, and they would be known by the name the Egyptians gave them, the Sea Peoples. They were apparently an alliance of several groups, possibly including Phrygians, indo-europeans from the west coast of the Black Sea, who would occupy Anatolia after the Hittites disappeared. Whoever they were and wherever they came from, the attackers obliterated the Hittite world, reducing Hattusha to ashes, smashing stone sculptures, slaughtering much of the population, and driving the rest into exile. And so, in 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire vanished, creating a power vacuum in the Middle East was destined to be filled by the Hittites' rivals and neighbors, the Assyrians.